Welcome back. This is what would normally be one of those walk and talk type things. As I mentioned last time, I wanted to get my Bible open just to make sure I'm talking accurately about what it says on the things we're going to talk about in this video. But I'm keeping it on the phone rather than and I'm sat in our lounge rather than in the study with the computer screen, because I wanted to try and still keep that sort of more chat on the go feel about it. So I've got my coffee. I've just taken a break from doing some housework, doing some tidying and hoovering to just have a look at this with us. And you may remember that last time I mentioned that we have this tension caused by what is often referred to as living in the now and not yet. The tension of the now, that we are justified, that Christ has died for us, that we are forgiven, that we are redeemed, that we are new creations. We are a new creation. But the not yet, that we long for the full consummation of history, when Christ will return and make all things new, and when we will see him face to face, and that's when we will be truly like him, according to John. And the now and the not yet means that there is this question of what happens in between. And we can talk about things like spiritual warfare. We can talk about sanctification. I talked about sanctification last time. We're going to talk a bit more about that. We'll also see how these things feed into the idea of sanctification and of spiritual warfare as well. But one of the questions that's been coming up is around what should be the expectation of the Christian. What is, if you like, the normal Christian life meant to be like? And that's important because one of the themes is around what status, what relationship does sin have with us now that we are believers? We know that we are free from the penalty of sin. We will sometimes talk about the power of sin and the presence of sin. What does that actually mean? And so, whilst we are very clear that when we talk about total depravity and being in sin and dead in sin, that's a description of our former life of before we were Christians, that there seems to be a sense in which we still have this battle, this struggle with sin, and sometimes referred to as indwelling sin. And all of that comes together in terms of a question about one chapter of the Bible, Romans chapter 7. What is it about? Romans 7 is well, I'll just quote a bit of it. This is Paul saying in Romans 7, verse 15, I don't really understand myself, for I want to do what is right, but I don't do it. Instead, I do what I hate. But if I know that what I am doing is wrong, this shows that I agree that the law is good. So I am not the one doing wrong. It is sin living in me that does it. So this is this sin living in me, this indwelling sin. And Paul at times will cry out, verse 24, oh, what a miserable person, oh, what a wretch I am. Who will free me from this life that is dominated by sin and death? And at the end of the chapter, so you see how it is. In my mind, I really want to obey God's law, but because of my sinful nature, I am a slave to sin. And the big question has been whether or not, when Paul says, oh, what a miserable person I am, who will free me from this life that is dominated by sin and death, and that whole theme of this wrestling here, is he describing the normal Christian life? And the debate has tended to be framed in terms of who is the I when Paul says I, when he talks about me in the chapter. Who is he talking about? Is it literally him? And therefore it's autobiographical, it's sort of his memoirs, it's his testimony. Is he describing his life and his experience of his struggle with sin? And if so, is he talking about what life was like for him before he became a Christian or after he became a Christian? Others have suggested that he is talking about Israel, about God's people as a whole, and using I as representative of what Israel is like before Christ. And others have said that it's not necessarily autobiographical, it's more a hypothetical me or I, a representative person. But even then, the question is still about whether or not Paul is describing somebody before or after they became a Christian. Is Romans 7 looking back and saying this is what you were like before you became a Christian? Or is it saying this is what life is like now? And there's been a strong push throughout history. I think probably the dominant perception is that Paul is talking about himself and about the believer, and he is talking and giving the testimony of what this is, what our experience is like once we become Christians. That this is the normal Christian life. And that therefore, we still have a struggle with sin that we are responsible for and that we need to repent from. How do we work out who Paul is talking about? Well, I'm going to just chat about it. I don't think we're going to deal with everything today, but we are going to make a start and then we'll come back to this. And of course, context is everything. People have spent a lot of time trying to determine who Paul is talking about in Romans 7. And they've been specifically talking about who is it that he's talking about in verse 14 through to verse 25. But that's not even the whole of the chapter, is it? The whole of the passage. And it's certainly not the whole of Paul's argument. So, quick recap. In Romans 1 and 2, Paul starts with this sort of argument that there is no excuse because God's righteousness has been revealed clearly to us, but also God's wrath, and that sense of being handed over to the consequences of our sin. It means that Gentiles, even if they claim not to have heard the gospel, have no excuse for rebelling against God. But it also means that those that have God's law, the Jews, are also without excuse because they've not fulfilled its righteousness. And that means Romans 3, verse 23, all have sinned and fallen short of God's glory. No one is righteous, no, not one. Which means that we need redemption, we need saving, we need justifying. And so Romans 4 and 5 begin to talk a bit more about how we are saved, that Christ's righteousness is accredited to us. And so Romans 5, if it's one man's sin that brings judgment and curse and death on us, then it's one man's righteousness, it's Jesus's righteous death on the cross that brings us life and forgiveness and our own righteousness. Meaning, well, we picked up on this last time, that Romans 6, that we have been buried with Christ and we rise with Christ to new life. Where Paul is saying that means that if there's no excuse for our sin, there's also no excuse for the believer continuing in sin. We can't go around saying, grace abounds more when sin abounds more, so let's sin all the more. Paul says, no, You are a new person. You don't belong to that life anymore. And so there's meant to be a change. And Romans 6 ends with a famous verse, 6 verse 23, for the wages of sin is death, but the free gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ. And so that contrast of death and life is very present. And then we delve into Romans 7. Now, let me just read the first 6 verses. And that's where we're just going to give some attention today to give us the context to help us start answering this question. So Romans 7, verse 1 to 6. Now, dear brothers and sisters, you who are familiar with the law, don't you know that the law applies only while a person is living? For example, when a woman marries, the law binds her to her husband as long as he is alive. But if he dies, the laws of marriage no longer apply to her. So while her husband is alive, she would be committing adultery if she married another man. But if her husband dies, she is free from the law, and she does not commit adultery when she remarries. So, my dear brothers and sisters, this is the point. You died to the power of the law when you died with Christ, and now you are united with the one who was raised from the dead. As a result, we can produce a harvest of good deeds for God. When we were controlled by our old nature, sinful desires were at work within us. Desire was at work within us. And the law aroused those evil desires that produced a harvest of sinful deeds, resulting in death. But now we have been released from the law, for we died to it and are no longer captive to its power. Now we can serve God, not in the old way of obeying the letter of the law, but in the new way of living in the Spirit. And you will notice there that the theme we were talking about last time is coming up very strongly here. The image of to be alive in one place, you have to be dead in another. That you cannot be married to a new husband if your old husband is still alive, that there has to be a death. And in the same way, Paul says, you died to the power of the law. That relationship is dead. You no longer relate to the law, meaning the Torah, the law of Moses, and the penalty that it holds over us, and the system of being right with God that it gives. A little side point, that doesn't mean that the law is abolished. Christ says it's fulfilled. And there's lots to discuss about how the law does relate to us, but it doesn't have that authority over us. And for good reasons, as we will see in chapter 8. So, dead to that old life where the law ruled, as we lived in the kingdom of sin and death and Satan, and now united to Jesus. He is the one who raised us, who brought us from that place of death into this place of life and gave us life so that we are alive in him. This is verse 4. And notice that there's a consequence to this, that the result, the implication is that we can produce a harvest of good deeds to God. It is possible to live in a way that pleases God, to do what is right. Because there's been a change. This change means that we are not controlled, we are not ruled by our old nature. We are new creations. And Paul says, verse 5, that desires were at work within us, and a lot of versions translate that as evil desires or sinful desires or wrong desires, because that is how that particular word is often used. That's the sense, although it's pure term, it's just about desire itself, but it's around the kind of the lustful sort of desire type thing. They're at work within us, and God's law. The law aroused these evil desires that produced a harvest of sinful deeds, resulting in death. Did you see that? That one of the things Paul is interested in at this point is law and laws, and in chapter 8 he will contrast the law of sin, but also the sense of the law of Moses, with the law of the Spirit, and he will say that the law is powerless to save. All it can do in effect is condemn. It can't change us. Because what it does is the law teaches us what is right, but it also teaches us how to do wrong. It draws our attention to those things. You know that sort of old sort of experiment. If I was to tell you to sit quietly for 10 minutes and not think about the word elephant, you would find it hard to avoid thinking about elephant, because my command has put the idea into your head. But Paul says this, verse 6, but now we have been released from the law, for we died to it and are no longer captive to its power. Now we can serve God, not in the old way of obeying the letter of the law, but in the new way of living in the Spirit. And why did I want to draw your attention to this? I wanted to draw your attention to this because in the discussion about what the normal Christian life is like and who Paul is speaking about, the focus has been on whether or not the normal Christian life is described in Romans 7 verse 14 onwards or in chapter 8. And we'll talk about that a bit more. But actually, what I want to suggest is if we step back a bit further, we realise that if we're going to ask the question, is Romans 7 describing the normal Christian life? Then we have to look at the whole chapter, including the first 7 verses, and including the verse 6 verses, and then including verse 7 to 13. I don't know why I've been saying verse 14 onwards. It's actually verse 7 onwards. That's the beauty of doing these little off-the-cuff videos. So is it just verse 1 to 6, or is it verse 7 through to the end? Well, if we want to think about who Paul is describing, then if Paul is describing his experience post-conversion, if he's describing what is meant to be the normal Christian experience, we have got to look at the whole chapter. So who is Paul talking about in verse 1 to 6? And the answer is that he's talking about believers. And we have got to read verse 7 onwards in the light of verse 1 to 6. Paul's insistence that we've died to that old life. We're no longer under the rule and condemnation of the law, and that means that it is possible to live for Christ, to live right, to do what is right. And I would suggest, therefore, to desire what is right. That the beginning of Romans 7 gives this very optimistic picture and reinforces that point, that the normal Christian life is not just meant to be about saying no to sin, it is also meant to be about saying yes to righteousness, yes to good deeds, good works. These good deeds for God that are pleasing to God. Not that they save us, not that that's our plea, not that that's our justification, but that God delights in the things that we do. And it's important to have all of that in place before we delve into verse 7 onwards. Again, please feel free to put your comments in as well. Thank you for joining in.